You're listening to Served Up, a podcast that features inspiring beverage professionals and topic experts that share their passions through meaningful conversations. I'm your host, Bridget Albert, also known as the Market Fresh Mixologist, an industry mentor with decades of experience. Grab a cocktail and sit back. Let's learn how we can make a positive impact in our industry. Hey, y'all, it's Bridget here. I had the opportunity to chat with my friend, Noah Rothbaum. He is a leading author and spirits expert, celebrated for his deep passion for whiskey, cocktails, and the stories behind them. His notable work includes The Art of American Whiskey, a visual history of nation's most storied spirit through 100 iconic labels. The Business of Spirits, how savvy marketers, innovative distillers, and entrepreneurs changed how we drink, and his role as co-editor of the Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails, a respected reference book. And available now, his most ambitious project yet, the Whiskey Bible, a comprehensive global guide to whiskey traditions, producers, and tasty lore. In this lively and wide-ranging interview, Noah shares insights from his writing journey, thoughts on the evolving spirits industry, and what continues to inspire his exploration of the drinks world. So sit back, relax, grab yourself something delicious, and enjoy the show. Noah, welcome to Served Up. It's a true pleasure to have you on the show today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm a longtime listener, I guess first-time caller. I've really enjoyed listening to the episodes, and I can't believe it's 5 years now?
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Yeah. I remember when you just started it. So congratulations on 5 years. There's so many podcasts that barely get to 5 episodes, right? Or 5 weeks or 5 months. So 5 years is really quite a milestone.
Well, thank you for that, Noah. I would really like for our listeners to get to know you, a bit. So can you tell us what your first real encounter with the world of spirits or cocktails, kind of that moment that made you think there's a story here? Was it a drink, a place, a person?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think like many people in our industry, that moment involves Dale DeGroff, who has a magical power of showing up all around the world in many people's lives and changing the trajectory of their lives, really going forward, right? And I met Dale in 1999. I was doing an internship at Food and Wine magazine. Dale had just left the Rainbow Room, which is now closed, and he had opened a new restaurant that was only open for about, I don't know, maybe 2 years. And the editor who I was working for, Pete Wells, who later became the New York Times restaurant critic, he knew Dale. I'd gone to an event, gotten a bottle of some kind of like blackberry liqueur, came in the next day with it. Pete said, we should bring this to my friend Dale. And I thought to myself, why does Dale get my bottle? But at least I was smart enough not to say anything. Right. Of course, the next day we go to lunch. There's Dale behind his bar. I give him the bottle. He was excited to get it. And he made me several cocktails that day. He heard that I'd grown up in the Bronx. He was like, have you ever had the Bronx cocktail? So I didn't know that there was a Bronx cocktail. Like, what are you talking about? Right. So he whips up a Bronx, absolutely, mind-blowingly good. Right. And I like spirits and cocktails, or what I thought were cocktails. Right. But when I had those drinks that day, it took it to a new level. Right. And they're irrevocably changed after that moment. And I realized, okay, like this is really pretty cool. Most people have no idea like about drinks, because what we think our drinks are not like great cocktails. Like there's a whole new level of bartending and cocktails out there and spirits. And that experience just opened my mind to, the whole world of cocktails and spirits in a way that I never had been exposed before.
Yeah. And that takes us back to, you said, what, 1999?
Yeah. So, I mean, in some ways it doesn't seem that long ago, and also seems like 14 lifetimes ago.
Yeah, it really does. That was also the same year that I met Dale DeGroff.
Right.
And he actually judged a cocktail competition when I was working at the Bellagio. I did not win, but I had heard so much about him, and it was such an honor and quite nerve-wracking as well to have him be a judge. But he had already really made a name for himself early on.
I mean, he was the source. Like if I was writing a story, I mean, we kind of forget like how different the world was 26 years ago now, 25 and a half years ago. I mean, this was vodka was king. I mean, vodka is still king, right? I mean,
sure.
3 out of 10 bottles are still vodka, but it was even more popular then. Every bar seemingly, if they had cocktail lists, they were all quote unquote martinis, which usually involved some god awful concoction that included, chocolate sauce, caramel sauce,
whipped cream,
some kind of coffee liqueur, and somehow that was called a martini because it was in a martini glass and people loved it. So, I mean, most of drinking culture was dominated by those types of drinks. You had almost no books on drinks available, right? You go to a bookstore, they had 2-3 books. That was it, right? And there weren't a lot of sources. So, I mean, I found myself, after I did that internship, wanting to write about cocktails and spirits and to a lesser degree, food and travel. But like, I kept coming back to the same folks like Dale because there was really nobody else to call. And at the time, he had so much knowledge. And then when his book came out, The Craft of the Cocktail, a few years later, that was such a wonderful resource because finally, I mean, it was like, it sounds ridiculous. It was also the dawn of the internet, right? Which now makes me sound really old timey. But like,
were you born in the 1900s? I was born in the 1900s.
I was born in the 1900s. I sometimes feel like I was born in the 1800s. I feel like, for my new book, The Whiskey Bible, and so much of my work, like, I spend so much of my time reading old newspapers and magazines from the 1900s, from the 1800s, sometimes back to the 1700s, finding books from then. But yeah, I mean, Dale, like in the early 2000s, like with sort of the beginning of the internet, it was even hard to find like recipes that cocktail recipes that you knew would be good, right? Like there are always lots of recipes, and you could find books that were like 5,000 cocktail recipes everybody should know. But like, I had a rule, like, if I could find, if Dale had a recipe like in his book or on, I guess, his site at the time or in another, that I knew would be good, right? And then later, like, well, around that same time period, my colleague and friend, Dave Wondrich, was writing for Esquire and was doing their Esquire cocktail database at the time. So if like I could find a recipe from Dale or Dave, I knew it was going to be good and there'd be information about it. Which at the time was probably the most information you could find about the history of, or the history and the creator of that drink, if that was known. I mean, probably now, what even, a barback, in a, run of the mill craft cocktail bar, if they went to Tales of the Cocktail 20 years ago, would know more than anybody else. You know what I mean? Like, so
true. It's so true.
It was so hard, and we've done so much work to try to like find these histories, find the knowledge, find the ingredients, recreate all of this stuff that was lost. That, I mean, it's wonderful that it's all back, but it's also kind of funny because so many of the drinkers now have never lived in a world where there wasn't super premium tequila, or
they're spoiled, Noah.
Right.
They're fucking spoiled. Let's just be real about it.
I mean, it's good. It's good. It's
they never had a crappy drink.
or they
And a
never
lot of the
ordered.
bartenders never had to make a crappy drink.
Right. Or they've never hopefully experienced, ordering a rye Manhattan and a bartender pulling a bottle of blended Canadian whiskey. You know what I mean? Like, because we didn't know anything. We thought, oh, that, blended Canadian whiskey is the same as straight rye whiskey. Obviously, it's not. I mean, there are now wonderful straight Canadian rye whiskeys, but even then you couldn't get any straight rye, no matter who produced it. I mean, there are now ryes
Yeah.
made all over the world, but again, I mean, it's just you're one of the people who like doesn't give me a look like I've lost my mind when I'm talking about this, because so many people now like don't even understand like how close we were to losing rye. I mean, rye was like on its literally.
Deathbed.
I mean, yeah, it was circling
Yeah.
the drain. I mean, the few people who made it one day a year, and there were like,
Mhm.
literally like 3 or 4 distilleries.
Right.
Bourbon wasn't much in a much better state. I mean, there are only, what is it? At the worst part, it's like 6 distilleries that are making bourbon in America, right? So bourbon's also like hanging on for dear life. Scotch,
Mhm.
is holding on because, the bottom really falls out so much of the whiskey industry in the 70s and 80s in America, in Europe, in Japan. So, really for like the last 20 years of the 20th century, all of these whiskey categories are holding on for dear life. I mean, you do have the popularity of vodka, which sort of sustains cocktails and spirits, and rum and gin to a lesser extent, but it didn't have that prestige or popularity that it does now. And it's
Yeah.
kind of amazing. I mean, it's the classic David versus Goliath. I mean, somehow we won. I mean, I remember going to Tales the first year. I think I went in 2008, and everybody fit into one large restaurant on Canal Street.
I
Like,
was
oh,
there. I
right.
was
That's what I
there.
mean.
Yeah. Hmm.
I mean, it was
Yeah.
probably two, three, 400 people, and we
Hmm.
knew most of them, or at least I'd heard of them, or by the end of the week, you knew everybody.
Absolutely.
Now, I mean, I think trying to figure out how many people attend Tales is like one of these great mysteries of life, but like somewhere between 10,000 and 50,000 people who show up in New Orleans every year, which is crazy. I mean, like, you mentioned, Vegas. I mean, you go to Vegas now, like the casinos, like, they've hired folks like Sam Ross and others to create their
Hmm.
cocktail menus, right? There's no more crappy drinks, free crappy drinks in plastic cups and red stirrers. You're getting
And
like
there's not a lot
classic
of free
cocktails.
drinks anymore, by the way,
No.
Vegas. Come
Well,
on now. It's not cheap to go there. Where's the 99-cent shrimp cocktail? Still
it's
has the poopy
true.
vein in it, but it's fine. It's 99 cents. You can take it out. And you don't get anything for free. They don't comp shit.
It's a very
It's
different
a
Vegas.
different world.
Once they realized that folks would actually, the gambling was a great revenue stream, but the food and drink and the clubs and the swimming pools is even a bigger revenue stream,
Sure is.
and
Hmm.
that people, I mean, I think that's the perfect point, and that people are willing to spend for good food and good cocktails and
Yeah,
good
yeah. I
spirits,
think
right?
people
And
are
that's,
definitely focusing on quality now over, well, still
yeah.
quantity, but not so much quantity. Before we really dive in to your path into journalism and your newest book, that I'm so excited to chat about, The Whiskey Bible, but I want to get into your early years of Noah.
Oh God.
And so,
Okay.
at one point, did you say, did you want to be an astronaut as a kid? Like, I don't know what your
I
early
mean,
aspirations were. Where did you grow up? Did you
yeah,
go to college?
yeah. I
Let's talk
mean,
about it.
I feel like I was born on a different planet, and no, that's the Superman story. No, I grew up in New York City. It's kind of funny. I like to say I've only had like really 2 jobs in my life, like being a journalist and working at a day camp. Which so I mean, almost immediately for whatever reason in
Were you a
high school,
camp counselor?
I was a camp counselor, and then for
That's
like a couple
amazing.
of years, but like I mean, almost immediately in high school, I kind of knew that I wanted to be a writer. My parents are both voracious readers. Their house to this day is jam packed full of books and newspapers and magazines. And the school that I went to, writers were definitely held in high regard and esteem. And, this was like sort of the, 80s, 90s New York, like the heyday of journalism, right? With giant magazines and super thick newspapers, and we'd get the Sunday Times on. We'd go to the newspaper stand and get it on Saturday night when you could get most of the sections, and we get the rest of it on Sunday morning. So I mean, from a fairly young age, I kind of wanted to be a writer, and then I went to college and in the Hudson Valley, and I realized every summer I did an internship at a different national magazine, which it's kind of crazy. Like now that I think about it, like, I reached out to an alum of my school, and he worked at like Skiing Magazine, and through him, I got an internship at his sister publication, Popular Science. So I spent the summer at Popular Science. And then the following year,
Wow.
I worked at This Old House magazine, which I always loved the show.
I
And I
love
reached
the show with Bob
I,
Vila.
and I sometimes think like, well, I'll get to that in a sec. And then, this was after Bob Vila left, but the ghost of Bob Vila definitely casts a big shadow over to this day for This Old House. And then I worked at Food and Wine, and I sold my first story to the New York Times when I was still in college, like I was a senior. And I sold the story to them the summer that I was working at Food and Wine, which is kind of
Wow.
awesome. And then I was
Wait, I want to
freelancing.
pause for just
Yeah.
yeah, that's a lot. So, Noah, you sold your first story. You were still in college?
Yeah, I was
Is that
still in
right?
college.
To the
Yeah,
New York Times.
Yeah.
What was going on in your brain at that moment when that happened? Because that we can't gloss over it. There's such a few amount of people that have that happen in their life.
I didn't want to
Talk about
cash
it.
the check. I didn't want to deposit the check. I wanted to frame it. You know what I mean? Like, but I needed the money when I was in college, so I cashed. I made a photocopy of it, and I have it somewhere.
What was the story about?
The story was about there was a cigar store in Tribeca in New York, and they had a guy rolling cigars in the window. Like, so he was actually making the cigars. And again, this was like the late 90s at the height of the cigar craze.
Mm-hmm.
This seemed really like super cool and interesting. And, at the time my mom, her office wasn't far from that. And she mentioned to me, like in passing, is like something that she thought I might think was cool or interesting. And that's where, like, in Bill Buford's book, he talks about when he knew that he was like a chef when he's working in a kitchen and he smells the steak and he realizes it needs to be flipped. And that one of the like head chefs says to him, okay, like now you're ready to actually cook and not just prep because like you're using all of your senses. And that's kind of the same kind of feeling where when my mom told me about this store, it was one of those moments when like a journalist isn't, hears something and they think, oh, that's cool. And then the next thought is, oh, I could sell that story. Like that's a good story. You know what I mean? And that's like a muscle that like any good writer journalist has to develop. And at that moment I was like, oh, like the light bulb, like that part of my brain like kicked on. I was like, oh, that's cool. Like I could sell it. And at that time I did, when I was at Food and Wine, it was part of the American Society of Magazine Editors, ASME. It's sort of like I don't know, like they would give out like awards, which are kind of like the Oscars of the magazine industry, and their internship program was very prestigious, and you had to apply. And one of the speakers, we would have like a weekly speaker from different magazines, which was incredible experience to hear them. And this guy, who was, I think at the time he was either at Jing magazine or he was already at FHM, but both long gone. RIP to both of those magazines. But he was saying like, look, well, you're interns, you should pitch magazines and newspapers because you can say you're on staff. It's like that's truth. Like it's maybe expanding the truth a little bit, but it's still the truth. So I took his words to heart and pitched the story to the Times. And I wrote it for they used to have a section called the city section. and that was pretty awesome. And it felt like very much like like I don't know, like fantasy that to see my name in the New York Times, right, as a byline.
How
And
cool.
then I went back to college and I was writing for the Poughkeepsie Journal, the Gannett newspaper, about sports. I thought for a long time I'd be a sports writer. I was a sports editor of my high school newspaper, my college newspaper. And then after college, I went back to this old house for like a project and I almost stayed there, which is kind of funny because then my house would probably be full of like all types of tools and, vintage wood planes and hammers instead of whiskey bottles and cocktail books. But then I took a job at Smart Money, the Wall Street Journal's magazine. I didn't write about how to make your money, but how to spend it. And for ultimately I was there, I think for 5 years, and for 3 of them, I was a travel writer. It was a great experience. I mean, I was trying to shoehorn as much food and drink coverage as possible. Although at the time you could write about drinks like for the holidays, maybe Mother's Day, Father's Day, Cinco de Mayo, the Kentucky Derby, and otherwise, like nobody really wanted to hear about drinks, right? Which is kind of
Right.
hilarious. Like the thing nobody wanted
It's
it.
so true, though.
It was, and at the time, like the magazine had hired the Breckers from the Wall Street Journal, who used to do their wine coverage, to do like a monthly wine column, and I got to work with Pulitzer Prize winning columnist James B. Stewart, whose books are incredible.
Wow.
Like he was a big super wine fan. And like, he had the resources to like taste these wines, and he'd be like, "No, like, did you have the new, like, whatever first growth, French wine release?" And I'd be like, I read about it, Jim. Like, what did you think of it? So it was cool to like be around, the Breckers and Jim, and like help them on some of their stories. But yeah, I mean, it was one of these things where, I was trying every possible publication and way to write about cocktails and spirits. And then finally I sold my first book, The Business of Spirits, which came out in 2007 in the fall, which was,
Hmm.
about trends in the industry. I mean, it was so far ahead of the curve that like, I, it was probably like a little bit ahead of its time, but
It
it
was
was
ahead of
very,
its time.
yeah, I mean, it was very gratifying, like to meet people and say that, like, and also a little bit terrifying to when they would say, "Oh, I opened my distillery after reading your book," or this bar, or I got into this industry, I read your book and it was really helpful. And I was like, oh God, like, okay, like, I was glad that they had it.
Well, I mean,
But
I have the book and I want to ask you a
oh,
question about it because the
yeah.
business of spirits, it really did a lot for our industry. And I don't know that you
Oh,
have enough credit, like you don't take enough credit for that. And so
oh, well, thank you.
I do want to ask you, how did that experience writing the book, how did it really shift your view of the beverage industry?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of these funny things. Like, I met a book agent at a poker tournament. He had, one of his other clients had written a book about poker, and they had like a like a fun poker tournament, right? Where there's like no buy-in, and it was just for fun. And he was at my table, and ultimately I knocked him out and I won the whole tournament, which was awesome.
Well,
But
that's awesome.
but the biggest prize was like meeting the agent, and he had sold a book about the business of the NFL to Kaplan. They had just bought, the test prep people had bought like a business publishing imprint called Dearborn, and he thought, okay, maybe we could sell them a book in a similar vein about kind of the business of drinks, and they went for it, which was incredible because I left Smart Money. It totally freaked out my agent at the time. He was like, what are you doing, man? Like, you're going to leave your job? Like, don't leave your job. Like, what? Like, he was so scared. I was like, no, no, no. Like, my parents, like, totally supportive. My family were like, look, you have a family, you have a mortgage. Like, if there's ever a time to like leave your job and write a book. I mean, I'd already sold it, right? So it was like,
Hmm.
they're like, do it. Like, and I appreciate that. But you're right. It was different because it covered a lot of trends, like, the rebirth of the cocktail, the birth of, this kind of vodka boom, the rise and fall of whiskey, looking at, some of the categories that I thought would be the next big thing.
Hmm.
And what was funny was that, like, trying to figure some of those questions out. I mean, I tried as best as I could with that book, but really, in many ways, it's taken like 25 years. And maybe the Whiskey Bible finally fully answers some of those questions. Like,
Sure.
at the time, I was entranced by Irish whiskey, right? There were only three distilleries. There was, Bushmills in the north, Cooley in the middle, which is fairly small, and then Middleton in the south. And Middleton had been, obviously, like, all of these brands had come together as a last ditch Hail Mary to survive to build this distillery. And for a while, multiple times actually, Bushmills and Middleton were owned by the same people. So, like, I mean, there's such consolidation. And I was like, okay, Irish whiskey is barely surviving now. But at the turn of the last century, it was huge. There were hundreds of distilleries. It was the most popular whiskey. It was poised for greatness. Everybody loves it. There's so many Irish Americans in New York and across the country. What happened? Like, what, it was like one of these things where, like, like the dinosaurs disappeared. What happened? Like, why? And I remember calling people in our industry and being like, why did Irish whiskey disappear? And nobody could actually tell me, right? They were like, that's a fascinating question. I don't really know. Like, they would say, like, people often say, oh, prohibition. Like,
Right.
America was their biggest client. And then after prohibition, for so many years of not having their biggest client, it hurt them. And I'm like, I mean, that's true. But then you think, well, how about Scotch? Like Scotland sold a lot of whiskey to America before prohibition too. Like, they somehow weathered the storm of prohibition, right? And then it's like, okay, like, this can't be the whole answer. Or people would say, oh, Irish independence, right? Like the breaking up with the UK. And it's like, yeah, I mean, that definitely had an effect. But in reality, that question that I started to answer in the business of spirits, like, I only really fully answered, I'd say, Dave Weintrich and I co-edited. He was editor in chief. I was associate editor of the Oxford Companion to Spirits and
Hmm.
Cocktails, which came out in the fall of 2021. And we won a bunch of awards, which
You
was
sure did.
incredible, which,
Well
well,
deserved.
it was a 10-year odyssey on that book, and involved, we begged and pleaded with basically every expert that we could get on the phone to write articles for that book. And in that book, we definitely go into the history of Irish whiskey, and I go into it even further in the Whiskey Bible. But really, the answer to that question is that, like, the Irish distillers in the 1800s, they believed that whiskey should be made in a pot still from either malted or a combination of malted and unmalted barley and aged in a barrel. And that's it. Where in Scotland, thanks to Aeneas Coffey and his continuous column still technology, which was widely embraced in Scotland then around the world, the Scottish distillers like, oh my God, like, we can combine all of this single malt made in pot stills with column still whiskey, and we can make a river of column still whiskey in the time it takes us to run our pot stills, and we can increase our supply exponentially and also our profit margins. This is incredible. And that's when, really, at the dawn of the turn of the century, you have folks like, the Johnny Walker, Johnny Walker, the Dewars brothers, and others who really embrace essentially making blended scotch, like combining single malts with column still whiskey, which is obviously delicious, still a fan favorite, right? Designed for cocktails, smooth and easy drinking, and it became an international bestseller. The problem is that, at least now, using a column still, you put in distiller's beer, right?
Hmm.
It takes roughly 60 seconds for the alcohol to come off of a column still, right? To go through all of the staircase that's inside the column still, right? Distillation at its heart is a separation process, right? You're separating alcohol out. It takes 60 seconds to essentially distill it, and you can make a ton. It can go literally day and night. With a pot still, it takes hours and hours, right? 5, 6, 7. And in Ireland, they, even if you go there today, they built ever bigger pot stills, right? Giant pot stills. But there's only, I mean, the laws of gravity and physics prevent you from making, ever larger pot stills, right? There's only so big you can go. And also, there's only so many that you can build, and the cost of them is very, very expensive. So there's no way, even if you had a row of giant pot stills, you could ever keep up with one column still. So
Right.
basically, at the turn of the century, there's this amazing panel is convened by the House of Commons, or it's like the Royal Commission on Potable Spirits in the UK. And there's all this amazing testimony from, people, some of the Jamesons or members of the Powers family. And they say things like, no Irish person would consider like spirit made on a column still to be whiskey, and it's like they are dead set against any of the columns to whiskey. So really, it's like that commitment to pot still whiskey that dooms Irish whiskey, essentially, because they
Yeah.
refuse to use column stills. And Scotland just, doesn't, they were behind Ireland. And to paraphrase Bill Gates, they didn't play catch up, but they played leapfrog, right? And they
Yeah.
were far exceeded it. And at the end of the day, that doomed them, because until really the 1950s, 60s, when America was like demanding blended Irish whiskey, did they finally start really making it and promoting it as like a final, okay, you win. We're going to do this. We'll produce Jameson. We're going to change Jameson from a pot still to a blended whiskey. This better work, because if it doesn't work, like we're done. We're done. Like, so, I mean, it took like, I mean, that's like, I mean, I don't know, that probably half the listeners were probably asleep, but I mean, that took like 5 minutes to tell, right? But that's
Right.
probably weeks and weeks of months of my life, Dave Weinrich's life, Dave Broom, us all trying to kind of reverse engineer what happened here.
Right.
And those, so many of those questions that I started asking naively for the business of spirits so long ago. I'm bringing the train around to your question.
Right. Yeah.
But I was asking those questions, in '05, '06, thinking, oh, this is not going to be naively, oh, this isn't going to be that hard. Like, oh, just, somebody must know. Yeah. And like the answer is, like, at the time, it would take, much research to figure out exactly what happened and why. And there's a whole chapter in the Whiskey Bible now with like the history of Irish whiskey and its downfall and then its rebirth, and how spectacularly successful it's become over the last 25 years.
It really
But
is amazing because at the end of the day, Noah, what you are is a historian.
yeah, I've
I
been
mean
called
that
worse.
is
Yeah,
what you
that's
are.
okay.
You are a historian,
Thank you.
for sure. In your latest book, the Whiskey Bible, it had to have been such a major undertaking. And so, with that said, how do you think that it's different from your previous books?
Yeah.
And what did you want to bring to the global whiskey conversation with this book?
Yeah. Wow. Okay. I'll try to answer those questions. That this is, I mean, well, first off, the Whiskey Bible is it's the sister book to Karen McNeil's Wine Bible, right? Which came out in 2000. I still have my copy from then, full of post-it notes. I wrote a few wine stories, realized, wow, this is like a giant world that's so overwhelming to me and giving me a headache. Like I can never figure out, I'll never be able to remember all the varietals, wine regions, all the rules. I was like, I I was so impressed and blown away that Karen McNeil had been able to do that and put it in one book, right? And I was like, oh my God, thank God this book exists. All the information is here. Like if anybody Hopefully nobody will ask me to write any more wine stories, but if they do, I can always like double check things here, quote this book. Like I now have a great resource. And then fast forward, it was like January of 2020, and Workman, the publisher of the Wine Bible, since that they put out the Beer Bible, and they came to me and they were like, hey, would you be interested in writing a sister book, the Whiskey Bible, so that we complete our trinity of wine, beer, and whiskey? And at first I was like, I don't know. Like, this is a lot of work. Like Karen's book is so impressive. Like even 25 years later, it's incredible. Like, wow, like, okay, like that would be like a tremendous effort to match that. And I'm not, I leave it to the readers to see if I've even come close. But like, Dave Wanders and I were still wrapping up the Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails in the final days. But I finally came to my senses and like, okay, after checking with my family, like, okay, this, my wife was like, you should do this. Like, you need to do this. It's too good of an opportunity to pass up. And I thought, okay, again, naively, I know everything. What's the big deal? I just got to write it down, like double check some stuff, especially after coming off the Oxford Companion. Like, we should already expanded my knowledge and was kind of like a master class in cocktails and spirits. The hubris of like, oh yeah, this won't be that hard, right? And of course, again, with so much of the stuff, I went in thinking, okay, let me just find that document that everybody talks about, like the Red Book of Ossuary. Like, it'd be great to quote what it actually says, right? Like, because nobody actually, with a lot of the stuff, most people don't go to the primary source. They just sort of quote like the common knowledge. But it turns out, unfortunately, that most of what like we know as a culture, society, industry is not actually correct. Like, because nobody's double checked this. So something like the Red Book of Ossuary, which every, Irish and Scottish distillers talk about because it may or may not prove that Irish whiskey was made first and then Scotch, which obviously is a very contentious discussion I would never bring up with either a Scottish distiller or an Irish distiller. But like it took me weeks to actually track down what the Red Book of Ossuary, like a copy of it. I mean, it's in Kilkenny, but like it's written in Latin. I was the world's worst Latin student. I found a translation, but it turns out that it's really like a religious book and that people had written all types of weird notes and asides on it. And it was almost thrown away. And somebody kept it and found there's this one reference basically to making alcohol. It doesn't actually specifically say whiskey because nobody used that term back then. And it doesn't really even talk about grain. It talks about making alcohol of grapes. So like the kind of the thought process is like, well, there aren't grapes in Ireland, so they must have been using grain. So this must be for making whiskey. But then I kept digging further and I found like an academic journal from it was like right around the turn of the century that was written like an academic journal, not for like our industry, but for like religious, like kind of scholarship. And what's interesting is that the Archbishop of Kilkenny, who may or may not have written the Red Book of Ossuary, was actually English. And Kilkenny was a stronghold, an English stronghold in Ireland for when they took over Ireland. So if that's true, and he was English, is this knowledge in the Red Book of Ossuary that we hold up as the evidence for Irish whiskey coming first actually English knowledge about making whiskey? Because there are also, I mean, now there are grapes in England, people are making wine, but back in the day, people made grain, they made beer, they made grain spirits. Is it really proving that maybe the English came first with their distilling knowledge? So I mean, like it's a crazy revelation, and a lot of those revelations happened like in the middle of the night, late at night, Like, and it's like, who do you call? Like, I called Dave, like I called Dave Wardrich and be
Right.
like, Dave, like, is this insane? Like, am I reading this right? Like, did I like did I just overturn like many decades of what we thought was accurate? So it's like those types of things where over and over again, oh, let me just double check that, and it would turn out that it wasn't what we all thought it was, or that it turned out that it was the federal government right after repeal who decided, when they were making standards of identification for different categories, that American whiskey would be aged in new barrels. Like that was set. I mean, like you ask 10 people when that happened, you get 10 different answers.
You do.
And it's like, it's actually, it turns up like in an article about politics, like a syndicated column about politicians and the kind of fight between the different interest groups and lobbying, because the rye folks wanted to be able to use used barrels, because bourbon, as the story says, bourbon benefits from being aged in a new barrel. And the article says rye tastes like turpentine in a new barrel, right? Which, I mean, I don't agree with that now, but like it's definitely an interesting take. But really, what that shows then is that a lot of rye producers were probably using used barrels, right? And it kind of makes
Right.
sense. Like the corn benefits from that flavor from the barrel. Rye is a lighter flavor. I was very happy that the federal government, when they finally issued the standards for American single malt, allowed distillers to use new or used cooperage, like used barrels. I mean, obviously, in the Scotland, Ireland, around the world, most people use used American whiskey barrels. So because of the delicateness of the ingredients. So yeah, I mean, like all of these things, just again, I kind of thought, oh, like this isn't going to be that big of a deal. Like, just be difficult to get all this information together, but like at least the information is known. And it turned out like not to be true. And then the pandemic happened a
Mhm.
few months later, which, if there was a silver lining to that horrible experience, was me getting to spend a lot of time with my family, which was awesome, but
Yeah.
B, which
Same.
I felt very lucky and incredibly fortunate to have that time with them and to have people to spend time with, but also that libraries and archives around the country and the world rapidly opened up their archives online. So I suddenly had access to all of these libraries, Harvard's libraries, Princeton's libraries, and they would not only, I couldn't get the full book, but they'd send me a scan. Like, I could get a piece, and so it was like tons of fishing trips, where, sometimes it didn't work out. It'd be like a handbook on oil distillation, which not so, I mean, interesting, but not really for this project. But, finding all types of amazing stuff that these libraries or archives had either acquired or had been donated from who knows why, like over, decades. So suddenly finding like a handbook for Hiram Walker from like the 40s or 50s for their salespeople with all this like technical information, or I found like a archive that had like a lot of like Seagrams's like library, like had found its way there, or research papers. So just all types of interesting stuff that like normally I would never have had access to. And it almost went from like, not enough information, like when I was working on the business of spirits, to now almost too much information, where suddenly, there's all of these reports and investigations by like the US federal government, in the UK from their government, that you have access to, all the newspapers and magazines. So it's like an incredible wealth of knowledge. I mean, not just because a book is old or an article is old doesn't always make it correct, but like fascinating to read all of this stuff and see how people's ideas and views of products change. I found like an archive of Japanese newspapers, the ones that were printed in English, that like you
Mhm.
could read, the Japan Times, like they had an edition going back to the 30s and 40s. There was
Wow.
printed in English, but like an archive of that. So see like even the evolution there of Japanese whiskey, which was fascinating. And to be honest, I think like we've gotten it wrong as a culture and society about like how Japan has made their whiskey, and just finding all this like information about Japanese whiskey that really blew my mind, and was again was out there. It's just nobody really looked, right, or we
Right.
didn't.
Or had access to, maybe.
Right. I mean, both. And often like the people who have those types of that type of like archival research, academic access are not interested in booze.
Right.
I mean, it's that's part of the problem is that like archaeologists, most of them don't want to look into the origins as much as it would delight me of people making alcohol. And also, to be honest, a lot of this stuff, the original stills didn't look like the copper pot stills that you'd find in a Scotch
Sure.
distillery or the column stills you'd find in American ones.
Sure.
They were made of clay, and
Hmm.
you could make a still out of anything. I'm not suggesting that people do that. It's obviously not legal for individuals to make their own still, but I mean, to build a still doesn't take very much, right? And that's part of the problem is I think over archaeologists like are like, oh, that's a funky looking pot, but in fact, it was probably like maybe a still, like you know what I mean,
Right.
or they were made out of things that fell apart, like bamboo tubes and clay, and so who knows? I mean, so again, it's one of these weird things where like folks like myself and Dave Wondrich and Dave Broom and others, we're trying to fill that gap that like for other topics there are, every university and college has a whole department of people looking into X or Y, subjects, and there's whole meetings and conventions and papers. And it's like, I mean, which I mean, excited me in 1999. It still excites me that, like, in some ways, there's still so many good stories to tell, so many interesting characters, so many people who've lived such colorful lives who've changed how and why and what we drink to this day. And I feel honored to be the person to help tell some of those stories.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's so many stories that you couldn't tell them in your lifetime.
Yeah. I mean, I
There's just
certainly
so
probably
much out
couldn't
there.
drink all the whiskey that I have either in a lifetime, but that's a different
No.
story.
When
Yeah.
you were writing the Whiskey Bible, what was the most surprising or unexpected discovery that you made while writing?
Oh, I mean, there's so many. I mean, I think the Red Book of Ossuary is definitely one. The
That's
new
shocking.
barrel, that one's pretty shocking. But even small things like, um, you know, uh, it, stuff like like a brand like Wild Turkey, like is really like a Brooklyn brand. It was created by Austin Nichols. They were a Brooklyn company. Like, they partnered with the distilleries, with the Rippies in Kentucky. It was really like a Brooklyn brand. And that's something that Campari, no
That's
matter who's
wild.
owned it, has not really leaned into, given how many
No.
hipsters love Wild Turkey in Brooklyn. But like, it's just funny. I mean, like all these, like, again, like even, large, small stories, everything is sort of condensed over time and so shaped by marketing and sales that like often the real story is way more fascinating and
Yeah.
sometimes way more heartbreaking, where you have, distilling is like incredibly dangerous, like, and often not a sure thing. And you have brands like Lefroy where several family members die in horrific accidents, right? In the distillery. Distilleries, I mean, thankfully they've gotten a lot safer, in our lifetimes. And I mean, still very dangerous places to work in, but at least like, much safer.
Well,
And
yeah.
OSHA exists. And
Yes.
yeah, I mean, there are all types of rules and regulations to ensure that that the machinery is operated safely. But again, looking back, like in the history of distilling, it's incredible, that any of these brands survived, all of the roller coasters of success and failures and personal tragedies and triumphs. It's really, it's only thanks, I think, to people's, stubbornness and luck that we get anything, that survives so many years. But you get all these crazy rivalries and stories, where folks are trying to put each other out of business and copy their style and stealing distillers. And I mean, again, I think one of the most eye-opening and shocking things is just now through our lens, we look at so many of these hallmarks or signatures of a certain brand or a certain category as like conscious decisions, where in reality, when William Grant opens his distillery, he worked at Mortlock for like 30 years, which A, blew my mind, which I didn't know. But B, buys his stills secondhand from like the widow Cardew, and like, because why, it's kind of like Anthony Bourdain always said in his books, like, you're going to open a restaurant, don't buy new restaurant equipment, buy used restaurant equipment. Somebody's always going out of business, buy their stuff at auction. Your pans are going to look burnt and dented soon enough anyway. So just buy somebody else's old dented pans and save a boatload of money. That's the same thing with the stills. It's like all of these stills were bought secondhand. So like, did Glenmorangie, when they started, intentionally buy Scotland's tallest stills? No. Like, I mean, who knows why they bought it? Did Macallan buy Scotland's smallest stills on purpose? No. I mean, like, maybe that's all the money they had, or maybe their barn was one story and they couldn't fit a bigger still, but again, hundreds of years later, it's now a talking point and something that people, that we was a hallmark of their flavor and their whole thing. And it was just totally random why that happened. And I think looking back over so much of whiskey history, it's like anything else. It's random, right? It's things happen, for reasons. Sometimes things happen, it's a coincidence, and whether that's written down or not written down, who knows, right? But and then looking back, we're trying to puzzle out why a distiller or brand makes their whiskey in a certain way. And it's like, we jump to certain conclusions. Reality, it's like, that's what we had. So that's what we did. I mean, in Ireland, they use malted and unmalted barley, not because they wanted to change the flavor of the whiskey. It was because they were being taxed suddenly on how much malted barley they were using. So by using unmalted barley, they lowered their tax bill. I mean, it's not sexy or romantic, but that then shapes our perception of what Irish whiskey tastes like, right? I mean, we also, you and I have been in this industry so long. I mean, I remember Maker's Mark was basically the only wheated bourbon you could buy regularly or widely, and I assumed that all wheated bourbons would taste like Makers, right? That there'd be a similarity, that the reason why Makers tasted like Makers was because they used wheat instead of rye, in addition to corn and malted barley. And that if you or I also made a wheated bourbon, it would taste similar. But now that many distilleries make wheated bourbons, you realize that Makers taste like Makers because of Makers. Like, none of the wheated bourbons I've tasted taste like Makers. Exactly. Whatever they're doing is unique to their own,
their process, right?
Exactly. And it's just, or like, if you ask people what does Scotch taste like, they would describe Glenlivet, right? Because it was so widely available and popular. Or what does Irish whiskey taste like? Oh, they describe Jameson. And then like now, where there's like hundreds of distilleries around the world, realize sort of that like so much of what we thought were like category flavor, adjectives or the typical flavor of a certain category turns out not to be, but really just a single brand that for so long was the category. So again, I mean, like, it would have been a lot easier writing the Whiskey Bible 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But like now, thanks to this incredible explosion in interest and number of distillers in America, but also all over the world, that was also one of the hardest parts, and trying to get all of that in and hope that things didn't change that much, like between the time it went to the printer and it was published. I mean, thankfully, the federal government, finally issued their rulings, or their regulations, I should say, for making American single malt. I think it was a
Hmm.
few days right before Christmas, just as we were in the throes of putting like the finishing touches on the book to go to the printer, but we were able to
Wow.
squeeze that in. And I was able to get a few other, move some of the other big houses either sold or bought different brands, are able, because half the book for each of the chapters is what I call family trees, so that people understand that, like, somebody like Jim Beam or Suntory, that like Booker's is in the same house or the same portfolio
Hmm.
as Jim Beam, Knob Creek, Basil Hayden, Old Overhaul. Like, this is all one family, right? So for
Right.
each of the houses, which again, I think a lot of bartenders, certainly consumers, all types of people in our trade don't realize sometimes the familial relations of these different brands, especially because, companies break up, people merge together. So it's sometimes hard to keep track of that. So I tried to like separate that all out, which hopefully will be helpful to people. But even that, I was like, okay, like everybody stop buying and selling brands until this book comes out, please. Like, I can't move. I think the last one I moved Cuddy Sark, was it Cuddy Sark? No, Cuddy Sark I already had, but it was Famous Grouse. Like, William Grant bought Famous Grouse, and that was like, okay, like I'm able to get this, move it around.
Hmm. Yeah,
But
my
please,
God.
everybody, no more moves.
That's
Like,
still
no
for
more
one
moves.
minute.
Just
Right.
just until September 9th when the book comes out. No more moves. And thankfully there haven't been, like, knock on wood, nothing crazy, like, but hopefully, again, fingers crossed there'll be future editions of the Whiskey Bible, just
I
as
think
there
that
are
there
for the
has to
wine
be,
Bible.
because you're
So
really
yeah.
just scratching the surface with all the information that's
Well,
out
thank you.
there, right?
Yeah.
Noah, when you sit down to write, who do you imagine you're speaking to?
Oh man. I hate to think about the reader, right? I mean, I think it's like doing a podcast when I used to do Life Behind Bars with Dave Weinrich. Like, often it would always sort of, I don't know, I don't want to say freak me out, but I always feel very blessed, but also like a little bit weirded out when people would tell me that they'd like listen to the episodes, right? Because like sometimes it's easier to do these things and put them out there and just forget that anybody's ever going to listen to it, or listen to all the episodes, or listen to it when they're doing something like running or in the shower. It's like very personal moments. But I mean,
Yeah.
I think being a writer, like, you have to understand, like a professional writer, you have to understand two things. One, like, the publication, like, that you're writing for, and the tone and the voice of that, and who the reader is, right? So the Whiskey Bible, like, I was trying to walk that tightrope where, folks who were new to this industry or just getting into whiskey, there'd be a lot for them to find. And then they could keep coming back to the book. I mean, again, I stole this all from Karen McNeil and her wine Bible, which she does such a magnificent job of doing. That, like, if you need basic information, it's there. If you're like a connoisseur, there's information there. If you're an expert, there's information there. And it's kind of the same way where hopefully this book there's enough there. I mean, it is over 600 pages, but hopefully there's enough there to keep you coming back as your interest level and interest change in terms of whiskey, so that, if you get into, my goal was that, like, if you read about a whiskey, or you heard about a brand, or you saw it on a list or at a store shelf, or somebody told you about it, you could then go to the book and kind of like look in there and be like, oh, okay, cool. That's what this whiskey is about. It doesn't have tasting notes. Obviously, a lot of whiskey books do, but those often, it's very hard unless you're doing an annual release to keep up with how these whiskeys change. So I thought it'd be bigger benefit, at least in this type of book, to give people like a house style, a history, and an idea of what this whiskey is about. And that way, when their friend or relative or boss or nosy neighbor says, why did you order that? Which is maybe the worst thing you can ask most people. That's the most terrifying question. Why did
It's
you
just
order that?
rude.
Well, right, but I mean, if somebody said it to you, like in a restaurant, and said, like, if I said, Bridget, why'd you order pasta? You'd be like, I love
Mhm.
pasta. Like, what's wrong with you? Like, you wouldn't think about it. But I was like, what is that? You know,
Mhm.
your drink. Like, I wanted people to be able to say, oh, you know what? This is like Scotland's favorite whiskey. Like, this is like, this is a blend, and they, blah, 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 blah. This goes back to, so give people like have that personal connection, right? That ownership where they actually are educated, and it's that connection to what's in the drink, which I think makes it more satisfying. It's beyond just the flavor, but getting everything in that glass.
I love that. And as a writer, you have spent years, right, documenting the beverage industry. What book is still missing?
Oh God. I mean Dave Weinstein, I always talk about trying to do books. I mean, now that there's so many books, trying to do books that nobody else has done, right? So my book, The Art of American Whiskey, I love doing because it's a visual history of American whiskey told through label art and bottle design.
It is
And
so cool. I
well,
mean, it
thank you.
really
Yeah.
is. You really bring history just to life through the label design and your storytelling. It's amazing.
Well, thank you. I mean, it was it's a very cool book to do.
Mhm.
It's like a hybrid between a coffee table book and a history book and a whiskey
Yeah.
book and a cocktail book. It was inspired because Bill Samuels, I was going out to Maker's Mark, and we stopped off at Heaven Hills Bourbon Experience at the time. And I was walking around, I saw all this cool artwork, and I thought, these old labels, these old bottles, and I thought to myself, wow, that would be like a really cool book. And then I thought, oh right, like I should do that book.
Yeah.
Like I should do that. And I was like shocked that nobody had really done that book before. But that's hard. I mean, that's what, Dave, his new book is the comic book history of the cocktail, right? Which is an
Mhm.
awesome idea, which nobody's ever done, is like a graphic novel treatment of the history of the cocktail, and also telling the full history of the cocktail, which is kind of awesome, but making it fun and enjoyable. But that's hard. Like, I mean, my next book I'm doing with the bartender Kenta Goto. So about his recipes and bartending philosophy. So that book will be out next fall in 2026 from 10 Speed. So that's the Goto Bartender's Guide. So that was a really cool book because Kenta, like, it's just, he's thought through every process of making cocktails and does things so uniquely and wonderfully. And that he was willing to share that knowledge was crazy. And again, made me rethink, everything I thought I knew about drinks, which is, the kinds of projects that I love. But yeah, I mean, I still think I don't want to tip my hand too much, but I think that there are still other books to write. I would certainly love to do a sequel to The Art of American Whiskey, which would be The Art of Scotch Whiskey, which is something I always ask 10 Speed about every few years. And hopefully more people will buy The Art of American Whiskey to convince them to do a second
Yes,
book.
listeners.
It's still available from booksellers around the country and
Mhm.
around the world. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think there's still so much, and once you start looking into any of these topics, you realize that there's just so much of a story to tell, and
Yeah.
even so many of the like original whiskey distillers, blenders, owners, like we've barely scratched the surface in telling their stories. And so many fascinating folks who built and shaped this industry, men and women and people of all backgrounds and from all types of, immigrants from all, a range of countries around the world. Nobody really, like, we don't normally talk about that history of whiskey, or cocktails and spirits. That part is I think in some ways the most fertile ground. Like the modern era we've got, like, you want like distilling basics, you want like, guides to visiting distilleries, sure, or, books about folks, in the recent era, or to learn more about the different categories, absolutely. But I think we are still missing some of those, and maybe that's the next, maybe those are some of the next books I write. I'm just going to leave it at that.
I hope that you do. No, I'm a fan. I hope that you do. And so looking ahead, what's the legacy that you hope to leave as an author, editor, and really one of the strongest voices in the world of spirits? Big question, I know.
Yeah, no pressure there. I think the ultimate goal of this book and all my books and all the projects is really to educate and inspire people, right? And to leave the world a better place, instill curiosity in other people. I mean, I think curiosity is such an important trait. It's so important for people to be curious about the world, right? And I'm fortunate that that's something that my family instilled in me from an early age, to be curious about the world, to ask questions. I think that as a society and culture, we could use more of that. And hopefully these books, projects make people curious, right? Make people think about whiskey in a different light, and cocktails and spirits, like see it as a lens to tell bigger stories, that intersection of culture, society, history, and drinks. I mean, that's the goal, right? And I think everything through the lens of cocktails and spirits is way more interesting. I'm never thought as a New York City kid that I would be interested in reading about vintage farming practices of the 17, 1800s, or dense federal regulations or policy memos from the halls of Congress, or lawsuits, or I was the world's worst chemistry student and not much better bio student, but learning about that side of making whiskey and fermentation. I mean, it's fascinating, right? And getting to be friends with people like Todd Leopold from Leopold Brothers, or Nicole Austin from Tickle, or being able to pick the brain of somebody, the late great Dave Pickerel for so long, and just getting so much of that knowledge and being able to ask them my questions sort of on behalf of myself, but also my readers. I mean, I think it's one of these things that if you have a question about something, then probably many people have that same question, right? And I always say, when I'm doing talks, there are no stupid questions about cocktails and spirits. And then also everybody should drink what they enjoy. Don't let, it's not my job to tell you what to drink, right? It's not a bartender's job. Don't drink what, you see somebody on TV or in a movie drinking. Drink something that you enjoy, and take command of that, right? Take charge, feel empowered to drink what makes you happy, right? And whether that's, rum and Coke, or that's like a classic daiquiri, there should be no judgment, right? I mean, my job is to help you, maybe deepen that love of that cocktail, or help expose you to other things that you might like. But really, I mean, if you love drinking, room temperature gin, with iced tea, well, that's, so be it. That's, maybe I'm not going to have that drink with you, but you should drink what makes you happy. And I think hopefully this next phase of our ever evolving drinks world, people will feel like they, have more control and, over what they drink, and not just listen to other folks or be intimidated by other folks. All of these rules about, drinks, and most of them historically anyway don't hold up, which is kind of hilarious to me. Scotch was originally made really for cocktails, and that's how it was marketed in America. So people telling you that you can't add ice or club soda or ginger beer is ridiculous. So yeah, I mean, look, a lot of that stuff was done for marketing reasons. So, I mean, I think that's, I try to be like people's like your good friend who just knows a little bit more about drinks, and like you're not embarrassed to like ask silly questions, and and I can whisper them, so nobody else hears in the bar, like,
I love it.
Yeah.
Love it. Noah, where can our listeners find your books?
The books are available really anywhere that, online or brick and mortar stores. But yeah, the Whiskey Bible comes out on September 9th. Thank you so much, Bridget, for having me on, all the kind words, all the support over the years reading the books. I appreciate it more than you know.
Well, Noah, you are truly a historian and someone to admire, an educator, someone I look up to. And I do go to your books to be more knowledgeable. So I appreciate your work. I truly do, and your friendship. And with that said, I just want to wish you some great health and a lot of peace. And I hope you'll come back on the show.
I would love it. I would love it.
Thanks for listening. Served Up is brought to you by Southern Glazers Wine and Spirits. Produced by Zunu.online. Music by We Killed the Lion can be found on Spotify. Make sure to subscribe to be notified of our future Served Up episodes. Cheers.